Welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another deeper dive into the archive. In this video, I'm sort of slipping my way back into the territory of Kennedy Space Center, a subject I've already covered a couple of times on the channel. Not that I've covered it extensively, but I did a long look at the early days of KSC, basically the years before it was named posthumously for President John F. Kennedy in 1964. I also covered KSC in an interesting video I made about a Florida Vacation album from 1982. The album tells the story of a Texas family who visited Central Florida and bought an impressive amount of stuff from the KSC Visitor Center. I've been there many times. And that gets me to the point of the video, I think. I'll be sharing more documents from the archive while discussing an interesting art installation currently showing at the Orlando Museum of Art. It'll be there until June 14th, 2026, so hopefully you're seeing this before that date. Now, you might be asking what my Kennedy Space Center documents have to do with an art show, but it's pretty simple. The show is titled Dennis Scholl, A Day of Four Sunsets, and has to do with Scholl's look at the space program from its early days of the Mercury project into the Space Shuttle era. He collected a number of documents which he presents in this art, and I was lucky enough to attend the press event where he spoke. So I'm showing some of the artwork while he talks about it, and then I'll add some supporting documents from the archive. What Scholl presents are documents and items related to the NASA missions themselves, while much of my collection tells the story of Kennedy Space Center as a tourist attraction. That includes more than 60 years of souvenir booklets like these, which were sold at KSC. It's kind of strange connections when you think of it. The tourism aspect of Kennedy Space Center is only indirectly connected with why KSC exists. Unlike a theme park, zoo, or botanical garden, KSC would do what it does even if there wasn't a visitor center, bus tours, and stadium seating for launches. In fact, those things were afterthoughts which were created long after the first rocket launched from Cape Canaveral. Still, the attraction aspect of KSC has been extremely important since the late 1960s, and even today, it's the #1 tourist attraction in Florida after the theme parks. Artist Dennis Scholl's biography states, Dennis Scholl is an artist and award-winning documentary filmmaker focusing on arts and culture. His studio art practice focuses on assemblage of historical objects. He mines archival materials, creating unexpected entanglements between memory, artifact, and conceptual drawings. Interrogating memory, Dennis uses source materials that reflect his own lived experience, like baseball cards, while also accessing more divergent historical and pop cultural resources. His practice questions how we assign memory and value to objects, and though it seems to conserve and resuscitate archival materials, it also reimagines its very form. His work has been exhibited widely across Europe and in New York and Miami. As a filmmaker, he directed the feature documentary The Last Resort, which won the Miami Jewish Film Festival Audience Choice Award, received a national theatrical release, and screened on Netflix. He has made a number of other successful, popular, and award-winning documentaries as well. Now in this show, the art is made up of smaller images, but I'm not showing the art in detail since art should be seen in real life. That way the viewer can get as close to it as they want. Looking at art on a two-dimensional screen shown at YouTube's low quality is a poor representation of the real thing. Plus, part of Scholl's work is the presentation. The documents could have easily been shown in a small frames that hang in rows on the wall, but that's not what he wanted.
So the show begins with me asking you a question, one question. And that is, what is your most vivid collective memory? And so for me, my most vivid collective memory is the Kennedy assassination. But my second most vivid collective memory is this. We all wanted to be astronauts at that point. So this show is an homage, really, to the space race. It's an important part of my remembrances, if you will. And so I've spent the last probably 5 or 6 years gathering NASA memorabilia, if you will. But not only NASA memorabilia. For example, what do people eat in space? This is what they eat. These are Russian rations from the Space Shuttle. And they're all in Russian. But you can tell, this is some kind of gel that you would eat that's a vegetable or a fruit of some kind. These are just your standard kind of sugary candies. And I forget the rest. There's a lot of them. But I wanted to put this out because, we think about the space race and we think about it only in launching a couple of universal communications and then coming back to Earth, and hopefully everybody survives. But there's a lot that goes on during that time period, and so I began to gather these things.
Scholl chose to focus on the food that early cosmonauts were provided by the Soviet space program, but astronauts in the early days ate much the same stuff. Of course, when you're only spending a few hours away from Earth, eating isn't all that important. However, NASA knew that doing research on eating in space would be useful for future missions. Early astronauts had many different tasks to perform, including figuring out how to eat and drink in space. The KSC booklets and information brochures are mostly quiet on the types and forms of food that were consumed, but we know that they progressed over the years to include quite a bit of stuff similar to that eaten down here. The biggest thing to understand is that it's not just the weightlessness that's the issue. For example, one could eat a sandwich in zero gravity. In fact, there's one instance where a sandwich flew on an early mission, that of Gemini 3 in 1965. Commanded by Gus Grissom and piloted by John Young, it's known that Young smuggled a corned beef sandwich, reportedly a favorite of Grissom's. Their flight of 3 orbits lasted under 5 hours, and while Young gave the contraband to his commander, Grissom chose not to eat it. NASA doctors had requested that he not eat on the flight, and Young was on a specific diet. The other issue is that any crumbs from the sandwich could have floated into some of the equipment. While the risk of damage might have been very low, Grissom and Young simply didn't want to take the risk. Just 6 years later, the food on NASA flights had advanced to a point where a famous Florida soup was part of the menu. I did a video last year on that story, which you can see here. Known originally as soup romaine, it was a specialty of Chalet Suzanne, a popular hotel and restaurant in Lake Wales. The soup was a favorite of Apollo 15 pilot James Irwin, who requested it be added to the menu. The NASA kitchen researched it, and it was approved. It proved popular with the 15 crew, and soup romaine, now known as moon soup, also flew on Apollo 16 as well as 1975's Apollo Soyuz, the International Space Mission where astronauts and cosmonauts first met in space. Moon soup, originally from Lake Wales, was one of the first foods eaten by 2 nationalities in space. By the way, you can get space food at Kennedy Space Center, though not in the cafe. Instead, astronaut ice cream can be bought in the store, and it still flies with NASA space missions as well. I buy a couple packets every time I visit. John Glenn's story remains one of the most popular that's told at KSC.
And to him, that was a miracle. It was like just kind of like an epiphany for what he was thinking about. But I don't show him in space. This is John Glenn shaving that day, eating his breakfast, getting one last checkup by the doctor, starting to climb into the spacesuit, and then eventually he goes into the capsule and he takes off. But there's a he had a minor mishap, he says. You know, they were having a hard time with the escape hatches throughout the early NASA days. And so this is an original NASA document explaining that and what happened.
It was the success of his 1962 mission, as well as his popularity, that pushed NASA into realizing the need for some sort of visitor center at Cape Canaveral. It was also in '62 that NASA published this 66-page booklet that told about the early years, culminating in Glenn's flight. It wasn't the only publication featuring Glenn, however. NASA and the National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC, also released this 12-inch record titled Go, Colonel Glenn in Orbit. The album contains 50 minutes of audio, including excerpts from Glenn's flight.
T-minus 10 seconds, counting. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
There was
1,
the ignition of the verniers.
0, ignition, liftoff.
Liftoff. The clock is operating. We're underway. Roger, reading you loud and clear. Roger, we're programming and roll okay.
Altitude, little better than 3,000 feet. Speed a little over 200 miles an hour. Altitude, 40,000 feet. Speed over 1,200 miles an hour. Vibration here in the rocket is dampened out by those vernier engines, the little side fellows that wiggle and waggle.
We're smoothing out some now, getting out of the vibration area. Roger, you're through max Q. Flight path is very good. Pitch 4-3. Getting out real fine. Cabin pressure coming down 5-7. Okay, flight very smooth now.
Altitude now, 75,000 feet. Speed about 2,500. He's leaving the atmosphere and entering space. It looks clean. The
Amps 2-5. Cabin pressure holding at 5-8. Oh, Roger, reading you loud and clear, 7. Cape is go. We're standing by for you. Roger, Cape is go, and I am go. Our capsule is in good shape.
altitude, 40 miles. Speed, 5,000 miles an hour. The two booster engines are due to cut at any moment.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger, turnaround has started. Capsule turning around, and I could see the booster during turnaround just a couple of 100 yards behind me. It was beautiful.
This is Mercury Control. All indications here are that we will be able to confirm orbit within a matter of a couple of minutes. John Glenn in the Friendship 7 spacecraft is traveling at a velocity of 17,545 miles an hour and is in an orbit ranging from 100 miles at the perigee or low point to an altitude of 160 miles at its apogee or high point.
It wasn't the first NASA record, though. Alan Shepard, the first astronaut in space, also had one, as did Wally Schirra, who followed Glenn into space. I haven't had a chance to make videos of the Shepard and Glenn records yet. I'll do that one of these days. I should probably make a playlist of KSC-related videos anyhow.
Now, the other thing to remember is that a lot of people paid a significant price for us going into space. So you have here the 3 Apollo astronauts, Gus Grissom and Chaffee and White. And of course, they were doing a test run and they had an electrical failure and had pure oxygen in the capsule and they died immediately. So you'll notice these two are framed in black. Is anybody here between the ages of 45 and 55? Well, I can tell you what your most vivid collective memory is then. That one. Because if you're between the ages of 45 and 55, that means that when this happened, you're between 7 and 17. It launches, you clap, and then I would say almost certainly it's the first time you saw somebody pass away right before your eyes, you know? So I will put this piece up, and tonight when there's hordes of people here, people between the ages of 45 and 55 will walk into this room, they'll look around a little bit, and they'll run to here, and they'll grab me by the arm, and they'll say, let me tell you where I was when this happened, you know? And that's what the whole practice is about. The whole practice is asking you to go on a journey that you've already been on once, but maybe have deposited in the deep recesses of your memory. But in fact, it's right there, very, very accessible to you.
While Scholl mentions Apollo 1 briefly, it was probably the most important failure that NASA ever had. As tragic as the loss of 2 Space Shuttle missions were, they both came after many years of NASA successes. So very few people thought that America's space exploration should end. Apollo 1 wasn't the same. The 3 men, Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger Chaffee, not only died without ever leaving the Earth, they were only inches away from men who tried to save them. The fire that engulfed the interior of the craft burned with a remarkable intensity due to the fact that the capsule was filled with pure oxygen. On top of that, the hatch opened inward and was stuck fast due to pressurization. That pressurized oxygen environment was totally unnecessary for the tests they were running. NASA had to reevaluate every major procedure they were using at that point. They did so, and that not only ensured Apollo 11's successful lunar landing just 2.5 years later, but played a major part in getting Apollo 13 safely back to Earth after its disastrous failures. As for Challenger, while I'm older than the range that Scholl mentioned, I remember the event. On that day, I was one of thousands watching. I had a friend in film school in California who had hopes to save money in buying stock footage, so he asked me to shoot it for him. I borrowed a 16mm camera with actual film and got to a good viewing location. You know what I saw. No, I don't have the footage, and no, my friend didn't use it in his movie. I've spent a lot of time at KSC over the years, visiting the Cape regularly and in earlier years just driving through to see the sights. At one point, even the adjacent Cape Canaveral Air Force Base was partly open to casual visitors. In 2002, I was even doing some non-space related work at KSC when I photographed this shuttle passing by on the way to a safe landing. As for the disasters, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, I'm not an expert, though I've read just about everything on them. My interpretation is that the powers that be, including NASA leadership, the military, and private companies, never seriously cared about safety in the program. NASA compared space shuttles to trucks, as you can see in this graphic. Astronauts who successfully flew on the 133 surviving missions might want to consider themselves fortunate to return safely. Understandably, the KSC Visitor Center doesn't spend much time on the 3 horrible tragedies, though in 1988, one of its publications, one written for the press and government agencies and which wasn't sold at KSC, talks about Challenger. To quote, "By 1986, NASA was approaching a goal of 12 to 13 shuttle launches a year, using a fleet of 4 orbiters. Then, tragedy struck. The orbiter Challenger and its crew were lost during launch. The Space Shuttle had just started to fulfill its promise of frequent and economical access to orbit. A large variety of scientific and commercial spacecraft had been launched. One expensive scientific spacecraft had been repaired in orbit, and 2 large commercial communication satellites were recovered from improper orbits and returned to the ground. The shuttle was becoming a true national and international asset, carrying into orbit student experiments, small business payloads, and foreign payload specialists." Note that there's no mention of the human cost of the disaster. Ironically, the terrific movie Apollo 13 has given people a skewed sense of NASA's dedication to the safety of astronauts. While the famous quote, "failure is not an option," was the directive concerning getting the crew safely back home, there's ample evidence that it wasn't applied by NASA to missions in general. 5 years after Challenger, KSC unveiled the Space Mirror. Dedicated in 1991, it was the first large KSC memorial dedicated to NASA astronauts who died in training or on a mission. It was briefly detailed in this 1997 souvenir booklet.
When we were pouring out the Tang, it pours out pink. And they were all like so disappointed, like, where's the orange Tang, man? And I said, come back in 3 days. And now what you have is a lot of orange Tang. Now, this show came from a venue I did down in Hollywood, Florida, and when I poured it out the first time, I was like pouting for 2 days because it was like, where's the orange Tang? And then they called me and said it was like a miracle, you know? So, and now this is an actual 70s, late 60s, early 70s jar of Tang, which proves that you can buy anything on the internet. I have not opened this. I'm afraid like bad things will escape, bad things will happen.
I'll happily admit that as popular as Tang was when I was young, it was not available in my house. My parents didn't buy powdered drinks, yet somehow I survived a culture where Tang and Kool-Aid were advertised non-stop. Don't think we were health nuts. I drank way too much Mountain Dew. If you're unfamiliar with Tang, it's almost completely sugar and citric acid, the primary flavor ingredient in actual oranges. Since I still have little interest in drinking it, I thought I'd take it a step further and make the classic Tang Pie. I'll put the recipe in the description. It's Tang, sour cream, sweetened condensed milk, and Cool Whip, mixed together and poured in a graham cracker crust. I'll also admit that I'm not a fan of Cool Whip either, but making real whipped cream seems to be a bit of a waste for this pie. Anyway, welcome to a very brief episode of Cooking with Stingray Tom. Is it any good? Make it yourself and see.
The Viking Orbiter 2. And the thing I like about this is these pictures would come back in these little squares, and then they had to sew them together. They would literally sew them together to make sure that you got a really clean image. And when you look at the images, they're really perfect. They're pure. You know, and this is the kind of thing I spent years and years trying to gather, mostly at auction sites. There's a big market for NASA memorabilia, particularly signed things and stuff like that.
By my count, as of 2026, there have been 22 U.S. missions to Mars, not counting the one that once operated in the Magic Kingdom. Of those 22, one is en route, and there has been 4 failures, including the famous Mars Surveyor 98, where part of the team used metric units of measurement, while another part used standard units. Still, that's better than an 80% success rate. Not bad considering the distance to Mars is at least 54 million kilometers, or 33 million miles if you're on that part of the team. Scholl mentioned 2 of the earliest, that of Mariner and Viking. Mariner was NASA's planet exploration program in the 1960s and early 70s and had successful visits to Venus, Mars, and Mercury, with 4 of them getting to Mars. Just a few years and a lot of knowledge later, NASA was back at Mars with Viking missions 1 and 2. Both included an orbiter and lander, providing color photos from the rocky surface of the red planet in 1976.
So everybody had a Viewmaster, at least when I was growing up. And so I've propagated this Viewmaster with all of the various space reels that they did. And it's a fan favorite, let's face it. People like to come in and take a look at that.
Just in case you didn't know, Viewmasters are a type of stereoscope and are a 3-dimensional, transparent, slide viewing system. Each circular card, known as a reel, contains 14 tiny slides, so you get 7 scenes as you cycle through the reel. The slides are taken with a special type of camera that takes 2 images from slightly different angles, which provides the 3-dimensional aspect. 3D photos have been around since the 1800s, but Viewmaster used slides illuminated by a bright light, were in color, and were often marketed to kids. They were inexpensive, but the quality of the images wasn't all that great, since the slides were barely a centimeter or less than a half-inch square. But viewing them in the viewer is pretty fun. Viewmaster was introduced to the public at the 1939 New York's World Fair by Sawyer's Incorporated, which produced other photo and slide-related products. Over the years, Viewmaster had thousands of subjects, beginning with travel images of cities, national parks, and other attractions. They were originally marketed as alternatives for postcards, especially for tourists who collected cards as souvenirs and not just for saying, "Wish you were here," to distant friends. There aren't any Viewmaster reels in the archive, but I am kind of an expert on the other Sawyer's tourism-related product, the PanaView slide. Sold mostly in sleeves of 5, PanaViews were actual 35mm slides that could be popped into the same projectors that photographers used for their own slides. They were often sold on the same rack as Viewmaster reels, but provided a much higher quality image, one that every friend and relative appreciated when forced to watch the latest vacation slideshow. There's about 1,000 PanaView slides in the archive, including these from KSE. And yes, I've made a video about them a while back.
So the show is basically just a remembrance from me to try to get people to step back into their consciousness and kind of pull things out that meant a lot to them. And of course, for me, it's space. And so I'm trying to take my memories and put them with everybody else's collective memories, basically. And it's a lot of fun. You know, it really is.
So if you're near Orlando or you're visiting and have an afternoon free, check out A Day of Four Sunsets show at the Orlando Museum of Art. By the way, Dennis Scholl titled it A Day of Four Sunsets because of John Glenn's flight, in which he saw 4 sunsets. The exhibition will be there until June 14, 2026, and is well worth a visit. Thanks for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Both of those help the channel grow. Also, check out my Patreon site if you're interested in supporting my work with cold hard cash. I'd appreciate it. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.